So hey anime fans, the series name is What If Naruto Got Harem with Transformer Prime. So let's start the series. It was a dark and stormy night, and the only sounds that could be heard over Kanahagakure were thunder and lightning. One person, Naruto Namikaze, was not in bed and was crying in a cave near the Hokage monument, as usual. He was attempting to heal what was left of his heart as well as escape the rain, but he and the rest of the village never paid any attention to him. Naruto was the son of Minato Namikaze and Kushina Uzumaki, but they never paid any attention to him or the rest of the village, all in favor of his two sisters, Naruko and Narumi Namikaze, the containers of the yin and yang of the mighty Kyuubi no Kitsune. The two girls were praised, and everyone seemed to be fine, but Naruto was forgotten as the two girls received praise. The 4-year-old had cried into his knees, "Why is it always like this? Why am I the one to be forgotten while those two are praised? It's not fair, damn it." Naruto had cried as he punched his small fist into the cave wall. When he had yelled, lightning flashed and thunder roared throughout the sky. Naruto then raised his head and looked up at the sky as another lightning bolt flashed throughout the sky. He prayed to any deity out there to hear his call and take him away from this terrible place, allowing him to prove his existence. "Indeed, it is not fair, little one. I have seen what your parents and this village have done to you. I will grant you an opportunity to have a new life, a fresh start, but if you accept this, you'll no longer remember who you once were. With a fresh start, new life, and a new name. Do you accept?" "I accept, but first let me leave it a message to my family," the enigmatic voice said, uttering the final words with venom and contempt. "Very well, youngling, do not take long. Meet me back here on top of the Hokage monument until midnight," he said, hinting that Naruto was thinking that a new life was waiting for him and that all he needed to do was accept it. "What is your name?" Naruto asked, and the voice was silent for a moment before responding. "My name is Primus, little one." Naruto then ran all the way home and climbed through his window so his family wouldn't know he was out in the cold rain. Once inside his room, he found a piece of paper and a pencil and began writing what he felt about his family. "Dear Namikaze family, I know now how all 4 of you feel about me, and I'm sorry for dragging you down and being weak, but even if you want me to stay, I know you had already disowned me by taking away my birthrights, so you'll be happy to hear I won't ever bother you again and you could enjoy your life with your favorite children." From Naruto, the clone nodded, took one of Naruto's old shirts, and ran off to the village gate to throw off the scent of the original. Naruto remembered watching his father help his sisters create shadow clones, and he memorized the hand signs, so he performed the shadow clone jutsu and created one solid clone. Naruto gives the clone instructions to distract his parents long enough for him to make his escape with the help of the mysterious voice. After completing that, Naruto headed to the Hokage monument while his clone fled the village and headed toward Iwa, leading the Hokage to believe that Naruto had been abducted and fleeing. Upon reaching the summit of the monument, Naruto yelled, "Primus! Where are you?" but received no response. "Primus!" he yelled once more, at which point he felt a presence directly behind him and turned to see a ball of light. "Hello, little one, it seems that you have arrived. Now let's get going," Naruto said. Primus could sense the boy's excitement and eagerness for his new life, and he smiled despite Naruto's inability to see it. "All right, Naruto, put your hand on me and I'll transport you to a new world so you'll start a new life," Naruto said without hesitation, and then the village was covered in a blinding light, and they were gone. The Namikaze family woke up shortly after the light was turned on, but it was too late. Naruto was gone forever. Soon after, Primus fulfilled Naruto's wish on Cybertron by giving him a new life and a new name, Orion Pax. The Hall of Records in Iacon was closed to the public. In the archive stacks, at a workstation where he had been installed in accordance with his caste's tradition and practice, sat a monitor named Orion Pax, who had previously been Naruto Uzumaki Namikaze. Beside him was a small turbo fox with 3 tails, more than a typical turbo fox. He was tapped into the communications grid, which invisibly covered all of Cybertron, and he listened to, annotated, categorized, and saved in a separate sector of the datanet. The hall, like much of the rest of the great city of Iacon, was built of a golden-hued alloy that lent itself to the curving architectural style that was prevalent elsewhere in the city. Iacon's architects had chosen to build tall, monumental buildings with conical structures on top that seemed to be ready to take off. The city was a monument to aspirations, but the Cybertronians no longer had any aspirations. They were born into a caste, a place they would occupy for the rest of their lives. The Cybertronian civilization existed in a perfect stasis, and it had been that way for millennia. In some ways, Iacon was a memorial of a Cybertronian culture that had not existed in the memory banks of any existing Cybertronian people. The history of Cybertron, from the legendary era of conflicts between the 13 primes over billions of cycles to the most recent broadcasts on the newest band's Orion Pax was tasked with keeping an eye on, was all here. It was categorized, cataloged, stored, indexed, and cross-indexed. After that, only when the High Council or another authority became concerned about a threat to public order were the ever-expanding collections in the Hall of Records ignored. At one point Orion Pax understood from reading the older records Cybertronian civilization had maintained links with other planets that surrounded other stars. At one point Orion Pax understood from reading the older records Cybertronian civilization had maintained links with other planets that surrounded other stars. At one point Ryan felt something similar to be in a not in a different world, but he shook it off as he watches via a network of space bridges constructed with technology long abandoned. Populations of Cybertronians on far-flung planets had stayed in contact with Cybertron, Gigantion, Velocitron, even the Hub. All were once part of a greater Cybertronian culture. Now the space bridges were all long since collapsed and degraded. The last of them, which hung in the skies between the two moons and the asteroid belt, had not been used since a long, long time ago. Even Orion Pax, who could ordinarily dig anything out of the records of Teletron 1 and the datanet, was not sure exactly how long it had been. Now, a Cybertronian like Orion Pax would not go to the stars or fight honorably for the Prime's lofty ideals. Instead, he would monitor, evaluate, and catalog transmissions on the grid, as that is what Cybertronians of his caste did. Other castes built and engineered, governed, made laws, or engaged in gladiatorial combat. However, Orion secretly felt that he should be out there, fighting honorably for the Prime's lofty ideals and making a name for himself, but had to wait for the right opportunity to strike. Orion did discover something from all of this, and strangely enough, it included some of the more intriguing transmissions that Orion Pax had been hearing lately. Although he wasn't a big arena fan, he was aware of the most recent champion Megatronis. It was a brave move for him to take on that name because Megatronis wasn't just any bot who could carry the weight of one of the 13 primes, whose actions were still reverberated throughout the megacycles of history. Megatronis had not lost a match since the beginning of his career in the arena. The gladiators had no names, and most of them ended that way. Megatronis had claimed not just a name, but a name that could not help but attract the attention of even those castes that pretended to ignore such degraded entertainment as gladiatorial combat. Conversely, at Kanahagakure compound Uzumaki/Namikaze dream, Kushina is far from the woman she used to be. The loving woman that Konoha knew was now just a brick wall. It all started that day. The day she lost her baby boy. On that night, how she lost her to the kidnappers. Waking up, Kushina could only frown as she had an uneasy feeling coming from the pits of her stomach. It was as if she just lost something or someone important, and it saddened her for some reason. Looking around the room, Kushina noticed how she wasn't in her son's room but is a dark room with steel doors with chains around them and what seemed to be blood over on the top. Memories. This terrified Kushina because she didn't know what's going on. That's when she heard faint crying down the hall. She had a sinking feeling as she remembered that she realized she had neglected her own son for years was too painful for Kushina, but she still needed to find out where the sound of crying coming from. As she continued walking down the dark halls, having a sense of foreboding, Kushina ran down the halls, but she stopped halfway down the dim hallway. gasping in surprise as she spotted Naruto sobbing into his arm with his back to her. Kushina took a few steps toward her allegedly abducted son and was ready to give him a hug when she noticed Naruto's entire form. "As son," she exclaimed, praying that what she was witnessing wasn't just an illusion. The little youngster stopped wailing and gently turned to face his mother. The 4-year-old Naruto's body was covered in scratches and whip marks that appeared to be leaking liters of blood each, but that wasn't the worst part of it, in Kushina's opinion. Half of Naruto's face was mutilated and unrecognizable, and what was left of his right eye was yanked out of its socket. Blood spilled freely from the wound, nearly making Kushina throw up just looking at it. Kushina's eyes widened in horror. Naruto appeared to have gone through a shredder. Worst of all, Naruto was grinning at her. As though those wounds were meant to be there, he was grinning. "Why?" was the only thing the hurt youngster murmured, making Kushina leap in fear. Kushina stammered, tears reaching the corners of her eyes. "WWYW what?" Naruto's happiness vanished and his voice trembled as he said, "Why didn't you protect me? Why did you stop loving me?" Although Kushina should be concerned about her damaged son's health, she felt that fretting about it would not help her. Tears streamed down her face as she looked down at his body and tried to think of a response. She began, but Naruto interrupted her to ask more questions. "Where were you when I was taken? Why didn't you train me like you trained Naruto and Narumi?" Naruto sobbed from his single eye at this moment. She attempted to reason with him after saying, "WEKQBT train," but she couldn't help but feel as though she was making excuses. When Kushina heard the question, "Why didn't you treat me like a son?" she broke down in tears and cried into her hands. "I don't know. I don't know why I didn't treat you like a son. I'm a horrible mother, so please let me help you. I'll let BBY your mother one last time," sobbed Kushina, reaching her hand out to Naruto's own. To her horror, she only grabbed nothing. Naruto's small body started to disappear into the light. "It's too late now. You had your chance and you lost it. Goodbye, Mom. I wished you tried at least." After finishing what he wanted to say, Naruto turned around and started to walk away. That's when Kushina notices Naruto's small body started to disappear into the light. "It's too late now. You had your chance and you lost it. Goodbye, Mom. I wished you tried at least." After finishing what he wanted to say, Naruto turned around and started to walk away. Naruto's small body started to disappear into the light. "It's too late now. You had your chance and you lost it. Goodbye, Mom. I wished you tried at least." After finishing what he wanted to say, Naruto turned around and started to walk away. That's when Kushina notices Naruto's appearance started to change from a little boy to a full-grown man as he disappeared into the wind. Kushina just looked at where Naruto once stood with wide eyes. It didn't take long for Kushina to break down in tears. Kushina yelled, "I'm sorry, Naruto. Please come back, my baby boy," into the sky, demanding to know why they would take her boy away. The dream's end. Kushina Uzumaki has experienced better days since that dream, but she has remained in a depressed state and has never left Naruto's old room. Her once silky red hair has dulled, and her once life-filled eyes have become lifeless. She still eats and takes baths, but she feels that her son is still alive and she just needs to figure out how to bring him home. However, when the front door knocked and no one else was home, Naruto and Narumi were at the academy and Minato had returned to active duty. She got up and went downstairs, and when she opened the door, she saw her friend Makoto staring at her. When Kushina stepped aside to allow Makoto to enter, Makoto said, "Hello Kushina, may I come in?" They both went to the couch and sat down, Makoto on the other side of Kushina, who was staring at the floor. The words, "Kushina, I know it's hard for you Kushina, but you have to stop moping around like this because it's not going to help you or find Naruto," made Makoto feel as though someone had stabbed her and twisted the knife. After screaming, "You had the power to be a good mother to Naruto but didn't, now instead of taking responsibility you're sitting up in his room not doing anything," Makoto slapped Kushina as she began to cry. Makoto said, "No, you don't get to cry anymore, Kushina. I have never seen Naruto cry at all, but here you are, so you're going to stop with the pity party, because if this keeps up, our friendship will be over." Makoto got up and left, leaving Kushina alone with her thoughts. She had a lot on her mind when she realized that some of her old cleanse grows, which she hadn't even touched, might be able to help her find her son. With a determined look, she ran to the archive section of the family library and started her research. Going back to Cybertron, few would admit to enjoying the sight of two or more Cybertronians tearing each other apart, but the pits in the lower levels of Kaon were one of the most popular tourist destinations in Cybertron, and the grid was filled with broadcasts and rebroadcasts of the various tournaments that were always going on. The only industry in Kaon that could compete with gladiatorial entertainment was recovery and reconstruction, and the mechasurgical engineers of that city and its gladiatorial rival, Slaughter City, were without peers. Arena combat was prohibited throughout Cybertron, but the High Council, in its wisdom, recognized that a caste-restricted population needed certain outlets, so the pits in Kaon, which had started long ago as a diversion for the workers in the great foundries there, were now established, even though they were technically outside of Cybertron's laws. Therefore, it was strange that Orion Pax would be hearing and witnessing arguments that he could only describe as philosophical from Kaon and Slaughter City, and that they were coming from the most powerful of the illegal champions of Kaon's pits, this Megatronis. Since the transmissions came from deep within Kaon's metallic interior, they were distorted and fragmented. Between those lower levels and the grid receptors, they picked up a lot of interference from the industrial processes that propelled Kaon and, as Orion Pax was aware, Cybertron's civilization. As long as the Badlands between Kaon and the Hydrax Plateau continued to fuel Cybertron's needs, the High Council would continue to turn a blind eye to the gladiator pits. As he listened to the latest communication from Megatronis, Orion Pax sighed and pondered how long it would go on. His fingers were hovering over the interface that would decide where he would classify it. Megatronis's voice scraped and rasped like one of the great machines in Kaon's factories. "Are Cybertronians not all made of the same materials? My alloys are the same as those in the frame of a High Counselor, my lubricants are the same as those that lubricated the joints of the 13 themselves." I continued to pet the little turbo fox while scanning the line of Cybertronians of the same caste. I spend my career monitoring and cataloging, feeding the vast databases of Iacon. This was the way the Cybertron civilization had existed for a long time before I was created, and yet they were made of the same materials as the archivist Alpha Trion or any High Council member. Would a counselor be a lifelong transmission watcher? We are individuals. Once we were free. Megatronis's voice echoed in my mind. If my fellow monitors could hear, how would they react? They would report this Megatronis in a nanoclick, I thought. The High Council, if they heard me now, would quietly render me into slag. Do not doubt it, they may be listening now. If I vanish, carry on my work. Soundwave, you and Shockwave will carry on. You are my trusted lieutenants, Megatronis said as if in response. Lieutenants? Are you now the general of an army, Megatronis? Commanded a second voice. As I paid closer attention, I noticed that this was different from Shockwave and Soundwave, which I had previously heard and had records and database entries for. I kept an index to keep track of Megatronis's acquaintances, but this new voice was missing. Who was it? Investigating was not my responsibility. Instead, I watched, noted, and documented. The investigators belonged to a different caste. I have to report to Alpha Trion, the overseer. I had spent a few cycles putting together a report after sampling the new voice. It wouldn't be appropriate to submit myself before Alpha Trion without a compelling rationale and evidence of its merit. What must it have been like to be able to ride the dimensional bridges to other stars? Alpha Trion, the archivist of Iacon, was much older than I was. I had heard tales that he had existed since the height of Cybertronian civilization, during the great period of expansion powered by space bridges. Alpha Trion exclaimed, "Orion Pax, what brings you here to interrupt my work?" The archivist of Iacon had databases and countless hardcopy records of almost everything that had ever happened in Cybertron's history, but he chose to use a stylus and a book as his interface. "I seek advice," I said, turning on Megatronis recording. Alpha Trion, like many of the older Cybertronians I knew, had become eccentric. The archivist said, "Megatronis," after Alpha Trion had taken his customary pause to tap his stylus on the desk and consider several possible answers after the recording had finished playing from a wall-mounted speaker. "Why has he named himself after a mythical being?" I wondered. If the old stories are true, Megatronis believed until the end that he would be vindicated. Alpha Trion stated, he believed himself to be doing what was right even if his methods destroyed much of what he professed to believe. "Not much of an example if you're plotting a revolution," I responded. "Indeed not, but perhaps that is not the only example to be taken from the deeds of Megatronis. Who is this upstart?" Alpha Trion stood looking at him with a cold laugh. "He has been a gladiator in Kaon, like all of them. He began without a name, a worker who took to the arena as a way to glory. He has never lost, and his fame has grown to the point that few other gladiators will fight him one-on-one. Now it seems that he is no longer content to be the greatest gladiator in Kaon, he has grander ambitions. That is not a quality encouraged on Cybertron, as you know," Alpha Trion echoed. "Ambition," he said, falling silent. I assumed he had picked up on a hint of longing in the archivist's voice. Alpha Trion said, "Go back to your post, Orion Pax, continue to listen. When you know what this Megatronis is planning, return to me and we will consult further." After he waited for a few cycles. POV of Alpha Trion. I pondered about the situation after young Orion Pax had abandoned me in the depths of the Hall of Records. He believed it was unusual for someone so young to have such a sense of what is past and what might never return, but that was to be anticipated when Orion Pax spent all of his time in the hall listening. It was unclear to me how to effectively present the case, but the High Council would have to hear about this gladiator identifying himself as Megatronis. "Covenant," I murmured, "what can we learn about this Megatronis?" The Covenant of Primus, which I had created in the aftermath of the War of the Primes, lay open on my desk. It contained the entire history of the Cybertronians and the beings that gave them life, all the way back to Unicron and Primus. The Covenant also contained the future, though that part of it remained mutable. I could see certain things that would happen because they became real as they appeared in the Covenant, but I could not always know whether what I saw would come to pass. The burden of knowing the future was placed on me, and I alone, but it was lessened because even what I knew about it was subject to change at any time, and I had some control over it as well. The quill, that instrument that young Orion Pax failed to comprehend, was one of the surviving artifacts of the 13, and was one of the most powerful objects in the known universe. I could use it to write the future into the Covenant, but this was a risky power to wield, and there was never any assurance that a change to the future would last. The Covenant itself had the last say. It was a book of unadulterated fate. I skipped ahead a few pages. One of the oddities of the Covenant was that the reader, who lived in a period of time, found it hard to understand the language used in its pages about the future. Even I found that I could read those pages only infrequently. The further into the future the Covenant went, the more cryptic and challenging the language became. The first pages of the book were written in languages that no Cybertronian had spoken in thousands of stellar cycles, and the last pages contained words and languages that no Cybertronian had ever spoken. No one in the Hall of Records, including Orion Pax, knew that I had written it all, including the parts written in languages that had not yet been created. If they had been told, none of them would have believed it. He had witnessed the history of Cybertron since its founding, and I had witnessed allegiances among the Primes form and break, so even the most credulous of the race of Cybertronians would not have taken seriously the claim that I was one of the original 13, the only one, I thought, still on Cybertron. It was no longer an age for mythic figures, and I was happy to have witnessed firsthand the murder that had destroyed the 13 and sent them out into the vastness of the universe. With the Covenant, I had stayed behind to document, observe, and exert what influence he could without disclosing who he was. The majority of Cybertronians no longer believed in the Primes, or at the very least thought of them as semi-historical myths. Or maybe it was a time for fresh ones. In my imagination, I pondered what it would be like to comprehend the Covenant completely, to absorb all of the information, to have the past and future merge into one. The archivist's struggle with something I would never comprehend was doomed. When I heard the name Megatronis, I was in a state of mind that could almost be described as nostalgic. I could still clearly recall the days of the War of the Primes, the golden age that followed, when Cybertronians rode the space bridges to the stars, was one of the greatest historical periods in the history of the known universe. The beauty of that era, which is now past, could only be remembered. I recalled the slow rise of the caste system. I had spent a lot of time discussing with Sentinel Prime the direction Cybertronian civilization was taking. Ultimately, they couldn't agree. Sentinel Prime defined himself by his actions and only considered short-term objectives and outcomes. I didn't need to define myself because I was one of the 13, whether any sentient being was aware of it or not, and I considered farther off horizons of consequence. Disappear into the stacks and let the dust cover you, Alpha Trion. Cybertron has no need of you anymore. Sentinel Prime had said goodbye to me after their final argument and sent me to the Hall of Records. This Megatronis, this gladiator and factory worker with lofty aspirations, how much did he even know about the Prime from whom he had chosen to borrow his name? I whispered, Megatronis. Now another had arisen among the anonymous masses of downtrodden laborers claiming the name of Megatronis. This was in the Covenant as well. I had not thought to see it happen exactly this way, but it was bound to happen in the Covenant's pages. I compelled myself to return to the present and started looking through recent documents for any indication of turmoil and chaos. Before long, I was engrossed in a narrative that I had not anticipated discovering in the orderly cities of Cybertron, and I raised my head and established a grid connection between Orion Pax's desk and mine. Please return, I replied. Megatronis didn't begin right away planning a revolution, Alpha Trion said, not on a planet-wide scale, in any case. He began by taking over the gangs who run the gladiator pits in Kaon and Slaughter City. As I stood across from him, waiting for the archivist to finish writing in the large book that was open on his desk, Alpha Trion put down his stylus and looked up at me. I said, criminals, as he began to speak, but paused when he realized that he had been about to express his belief that this type of criminality was unavoidable in a caste-bound society. Before he had a name, or took a name, he was a champion gladiator. He had some success. That meant others of his caste looked to him for his strength. He became a leader without meaning to, Alpha Trion said, taking a look at me with anticipation. Images and video flashed across a holodisplay over Alpha Trion's desk. The images were of destroyed Cybertronians, each one labeled with a name. Indexing them quickly, I discovered that each victim had been involved in running the gladiator pits, and most of them had other criminal enterprises as well. In the video, Megatronis, this was the first time I had seen him, stood over the sparking and twitching body of one of the low-level crime bosses I had already seen in a still image. It begins here, he said directly to the camera. Behind him a number of other gladiators raised their right arms, standing silently. You who take your pleasure from our suffering, and turn our work into your leisure, you have forgotten what it is to be Cybertronian. Once this was the greatest planet in the galaxy, now we have fallen, but we rise again. Because there are yet Cybertronians who can envision the restoration of our former glory. I have never had a name, but now I take the name Megatronis, naming myself for the greatest of the 13, the one who refused to bow before any of the others. Only by knowing how far we have fallen will we understand what it is to rise again. Cybertron. Cybertron, the other gladiators yelled together. The footage ended. I shook my head as Alpha Trion asked, "You had not seen this?" "Ah, this is the fruit of discouraging ambition. We train generations of Cybertronians who do not imagine what might be done," I said. I didn't know what to say, but Alpha smiled at me. "Never fear, Pax, I tell you simple truth. This is no game designed to entangle you in words you do not understand. All I say is that we live in a certain world. Few of us imagine what it might be like to live in another, but some of us remember what other worlds were like once, and some of us are foolish enough to wish that we might live in such a world again." Alpha Trion's stylus whispering on the book pages caused a pause in the room. "What are you writing?" I finally asked. "I am writing what I have learned," he replied. "As time goes on, we will all find out whether I have understood correctly, but now you must return to your post. Think about what I have said," I promised. And I did. I enjoyed being near a window, something that many of his co-workers were not able to do. I made my way back to my station on the 18th floor, third from the northwest corner, where the lights of Iacon twinkled in the distance when the winds blew out of the north. Some of us have the stupidity to hope that we will ever again live in such a world. What was intended by Alpha Trion? Alpha Trion's comments only made sense as a challenge to consider whether it was even safe to think this in one's own head. I flipped the archivist's words around in my head, but I was unable to come to any comfortable conclusions. To consider more than caste, to recall that the divisions of Cybertron had not previously been so strict, to consider the possibility of a future in which Cybertron regains its former glory, his thoughts were not focused on my task, even though I listened, catalogued, archived, and indexed. Now that Alpha Trion had opened my eyes to possibilities beyond Cybertron as it was, the sounds of the grid were unintelligible to me. I had never realized that Megatronis, a gladiator thug, killer of criminals, and criminal himself, had a desire that he expressed. In the meanwhile, the Kanahagakure Uzumaki/Namake's compound library Kushina has been working diligently to figure out how to bring her lost son Naruto back into her arms, but it's more difficult than it seems. It took her almost 4 weeks to locate a proper tracking seal that was hidden in the Uzumaki library inside her own house, which she had forgotten to check over the years. As she worked through the sealing technique, she discovered that it was a challenging seal that would take her many years to complete, but it would be worth it to see her baby boy back in her arms, where he belongs. However, she was unaware that Naruto was no longer a baby or even Naruto anymore, but rather Orion, who now has a bright future ahead of him due to a certain god and his furry companion. Kushina worked every day, ignoring her 2 daughters and her husband, who became more concerned about her than Naruto's disappearance. They were worried about her sanity and her home because she hadn't been eating or sleeping and had only been working to complete the seal tracker and locate her missing baby boy. Kushina wasn't the only person affected by Naruto's disappearances. Minato was also touched and had been trying to lose himself in his paperwork to distract himself from his missing son. The Hokage Tower Minato Namake's is at his office, trying to complete his papers but failing. He sat back and stroked his head, thinking of a specific person, and he sighed in disgust. His son, Naruto, a sad and remorseful expression came to the fourth's face as he recalled all the horrible things he and Kushina had done and said to Naruto before he fled or was abducted, and particularly disowning him. He glanced at the photo on his desk that showed his entire family smiling, with the exception of Naruto, who was staring at them with a sad expression. Minato thought, Naruto recalling the day he and Kushina learned of Naruto's absence. A flashback after Naruto vanished a few days ago following a stormy night, but Minato and the rest of the family were either unaware of it or didn't give a damn. He hadn't seen his surrogate grandson in 2 weeks, so Hiruzen decided to check on him. Although it wasn't that bad, he was rudely awakened when he discovered that Naruto had vanished. After discovering the letter he had left for his so-called family, Hiruzen informed Jounin that Naruto had fled, shocking them, and asked them to hurry and find him. The Jounin left, and Hiruzen prayed that Naruto was still okay. Suma and her daughter Hana used their hounds to follow Naruto's scent, which led them to the Hokage monument and the village gate. However, they were unsuccessful because the scent died where he vanished. The hounds started to whimper because they smelled something else, and whatever it was scared them. Sum also mentioned that whatever the scent was, it started to disappear as well. She wouldn't acknowledge it, but the mystery made her shudder a little. But the Jounin were aware of one thing: regardless of the aroma Naruto was. When Hiruzen heard the news, she hurried to check if Naruto was with him and fainted on the ground. Little Hinata, who loved Naruto very much, was the only one who was actually devastated by the news. As soon as she woke up, she started crying and yelled Naruto's name while hugging Hiruzen. Once she had calmed down, she went out and told Naruto's true loved ones, who were shocked that he had fled, sad that someone had taken him, and angry at the Namake's family. Having said that, in addition to Minato and Kushina's lack of concern for Naruto as their son, Hiruzen would always see the Namake's family together with broad smiles. He would glare at them and his students, who were still training with his former sisters without realizing Naruto was gone. With Naruto gone, how in the world could they have even managed to smile like that? Enough was enough. He then marched straight to the estate with a frown on his face on the day the girls went on a day date to their friend's house. He approached the front door and knocked several times, and when the door opened, Kushina Uzumaki was there. In a startled tone, Kushina said, "Old man? What are you doing here?" To her further surprise and perplexity, Hiruzen added, "Hello Kushina," in an impersonal manner. "May I come in?" Sure." Kushina let the former Hokage to enter by stepping aside. She shut the door after them and entered the living room. "So what brings you?" Hiruzen cut her off, saying, "Call Minato, Kushina, I need to talk to you two about something." Kushina arched an eyebrow but simply shook her head. She then sent chakra into her wedding ring, and a moment later, Minato was standing next to her. He was going to inquire as to what was wrong when he saw Hiruzen there, looking emotionless. Minato questioned, "Lord Hiruzen? What are you doing here?" Hiruzen saw that both parents blinked in response to the question. "Minato, Kushina, tell me, where is Naruto?" but chose to ignore it. "Naruto?" Kushina asked, pausing to consider when she had last seen Naruto. "He should be in his room," she continued, bewildered, unable to recall her son's whereabouts. Asking Hiruzen, "If that is true, bring him down here, I would love to see him." Kushina, realizing that Naruto wasn't at breakfast this morning, said, "Okay, I'll go get him and bring him down," as she headed to Naruto's room, but stopped at the door, Minato and Hiruzen following closely behind, only to find Kushina standing there. Minato questioned, "Kushina, what's the matter?" inquiring as to why his wife had not entered. Kushina said, "I've never been in Naruto's room, what if he gets mad?" but she ignored that and opened the door. They were shocked to see how empty it looked, as Naruto and Narumi's rooms were decorated, but Naruto's room was Spartan, with the exception of a few items that his close friends gave him and his paintings. "Did Naruto paint these?" Minato thought as he picked up an envelope on the desk and opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a piece of paper, and Kushina sobbed when he saw his wife sobbing. "To my beloved, it seems like my time is almost up, but I have one last thing to say to you all. Fate rarely calls upon us at the moment of our choosing. This helped me see the path ahead of me, so goodbye and good riddance, Uzumaki Namake's. Loved ex-family, I finally understood how you all feel about me." I wanted to say many more things, but I won't have time for that, and it wouldn't change anything. I just wish you knew that you abandoned me, ignored me for my siblings, and many other things. So my thought was right, young Naruto had left and hasn't been here for quite some time, Hiruzen said as he looked at the painting that Naruto left behind. After reading the letter, Minato and Kushina turned pale, demonstrating to them that Naruto fled, leaving his family behind. No, they can't even call themselves that. Minato turned to run outside when he saw another picture, but it wasn't a scene. Instead, it showed two hulking metal titans on opposing sides of the conflict, with fire and destruction surrounding them as they prepare for battle. Finding him and apologizing for everything, Kushina begged, "Lord Hiruzen, where is he? Where's my little Naruto?" When Hiruzen remarked, "He's gone, Kushina," the parents' eyes widened. Minato insisted, What do you mean he's gone?" "Because of what you and Kushina have done to him. He ran away from the village. I sent Suma and the others to go out and find him only to discover that Naruto has been taken." Hiruzen responded with a gasp of horror. "Because of you too, someone or something has a defenseless 4-year-old child. I hope you're happy for what you've done. Good day." Minato and Kushina, two distraught parents, were left to weep alone after the previous Hokage disappeared in a whirlpool of leaves. Flashback closes. Only a week has passed since the Fire Daimyo learned of Naruto's negligence, and Minato was given the option to resign as Hokage or have the village's funding withdrawn. Minato decided to resign and named Tsunade the 5th Hokage, who will take over as Hokage in a few days. "Sensei, have you found him?" Minato asked his teacher Jiraiya as he came through the window, hoping for good news. Jiraiya scowled because he knew the news he was about to deliver wouldn't be simple. He recalled following Naruto's trail, but he simply vanished, which also saddened him because it was his own godson who was taken. He felt like he was getting closer until he was called to where the toads informed him the prophecy had changed. And this is new prophecy: a child will be reborn and become the chosen one to rise to power. He would gather the Autobots underneath him, severing their bonds of slavery and taking back the incorruption on Cybertron to a land full of promise, Jiraiya said, waiting for Minato to comprehend what he had been told. This was the prophecy before Naruto disappeared, Jiraiya said, adding, "A child of my apprentice will either save the world or plunge it into darkness. Aided by gods with the chains of destiny, they will defeat a grave threat to humanity." Minato was perplexed as to what Autobots and Cybertrons were, and he hoped that they would locate this Cybertron. "We made a mistake, didn't we?" Minato asked, and Jiraiya could only give a dismal nod. Back on Cybertron in the interim, the pit floor was rectangular, and large enough for a regiment to hold exercises on, 200 mechanometers on its short sides and half again that distance on the long sides. It was made of ore pebbles crushed and discarded from the foundries because their concentration of metals was too low to be useful. Spaced at irregular intervals around the floor, mechanical debris and burning heaps of trash made optics tricky and created endless opportunities for tactical ambush and blindside attacks. Surrounding the floor, for levels of seating rose vertically to a ceiling 100 mechanos overhead. Banks of lights in every frequency from infrared to ultraviolet drenched the floor in the merciless light. The stands were jammed with workers in the factories and elemental refineries of Kaon, stomping their feet in rhythm until the entire balconies of each level bounced up and down to nearly the limits of the metal frame's tensile strength. The noise was already overwhelming and would grow so loud in the course of the match that the gladiators would fight with no input from their audio arrays save a constant maxed-out white noise. The Tournament of Champions, the grandiose name given to this arena circuit, had changed the rules for Megatronis' opponents, allowing them to enter first and assume alt form if they so desired. Anything they could scan and assimilate might be turned into a camouflage shape. This was a cowardly way to fight, but it worked in Megatronis' favor. When he could give the opponent the first shot the opportunity to ambush him and survive to win a total victory, despite this, he looked invincible. Megatronis had entered a pit 100 times and more. Word was spreading that Megatronis was now without a doubt the most feared gladiator in the Kaon pits. Not so long ago, he had no name, but now he had chosen one to frighten the timid and inspire loyalty among those who would follow him. That it was not his name did not concern me in the least. He who was born with no name did not care where his name came from when he took one, the speaker observed. My opponent is there, he thought. Although it was clear that Megatronis had long since recognized that few of his opponents possessed any tactical subtlety, his optics had locked on a pile of abandoned body parts, the type of scrap heap seen in the wake of an industrial accident, where dead Cybertronians lay awaiting reclamation and reconstruction. As the throng roared above and around him, he raised his arms over his head and waved them in an even more frenzied manner. Seeing Megatronis' pantomime victory before the fight had even started would infuriate any opponent with any semblance of self-respect. Angry opponents were careless opponents, and careless opponents were dead opponents. The reasoning was perfect. This served two reasons. From the pile of body parts erupted not one, but three fighting bots. They were collectively one of Shockwave's combiner experiments. He could tell right away from the way they moved together, and these three were primitive drones barely capable of what more advanced Cybertronians considered consciousness. One immediately changed into an all-terrain vehicle, its tracks studded and magnetic. It headed for one wall of the pit, looking for a higher vantage point to establish a crossfire. Megatronis kept focused on the other two, which sprang immediately at him. The first he knocked down with a blaster shot, the second he swatted aside with a sweeping backhand. Keeping the ATV in his peripheral vision, Megatronis pivoted to prevent the two bot-form combiners from flanking him. One of them reared up and sprayed a stream of corrosive fluid at his face. He ducked aside, feeling the spray of it bomb on his shoulder. The second made another pass at him, its blade-tipped hands flicking out at him. Just above the bladed wrist, Megatronis grabbed the combiner's arm. Another stream of acid splattered across his back, and he roared as he broke the arm off and threw it into the throng. This was a calculated move. He wanted them to know that he was dangerous and that whenever you went to watch Megatronis fight, he was always on the verge of bringing down the entire arena on all of their heads. He fought as though he knew he would die and didn't care, but he also fought as though he could never die and could take any risk without fear. The arm spun into the second deck, sparking and leaking the vibroblade's energon reservoir's residue. Some spectators lunged out of its way, while others reached for it. In a click, Megatronis saw the blade slash and eat through a spectator's arm. Another in the crowd grabbed the arm close to the break and flung it up into the deck above him. Fights broke out in the aftermath. However, he was unable to continue watching it since the bot on the walls was attacking him with more focused energy fire than he would have anticipated from a Cybertronian of his size. The explosions briefly put him off balance, and the acid spitter closed in to exploit the situation. When he closed with the mutilated combiner, Megatronis took the next burst of energy fire across his back. His philosophy was to always finish a kill. Two wounded enemies were still two enemies. He jumped to close the gap between them and used his strength and larger mass to push the injured combiner into the base of a pile of debris. Acid streaked his back once more, but Megatronis ignored it because he had taken the best shot the combiner could offer and it wouldn't kill him, at least not before he could kill it and its wheeled comrade. Holding down the injured bot, he rammed his ion cannon's muzzle into the joint where its neck joined its multi-armed thorax and blew it apart. This was another reason to complete a kill because the three bots would never be able to assume their combined form. Even over the crowd's hysterical collective scream at the match's first kill, Megatronis heard a chittering sound. He raised the dead combiner, swung it over his head, and threw it away to crash against the wall across from the seating deck where he had thrown its arm. The acid sprayer landed on his back a moment later, its pointed nozzle searching for weak spots on Megatronis's head and neck. Since he was Megatronis and had no weak spots, he reached back with both hands, grabbed the acid spitter, and slammed it to the ground. A few bits of it broke off, and Megatronis proceeded to destroy it. He would do this with just his bare hands. However, there were still surprises in store. The combiner escaped his hold and then slithered across the floor's fractured landscape with unexpected speed to join the ATV on the wall. The two of them then fused, creating a single alternative form that jumped into the air and hovered. Megatronis reasoned that I was mistaken and that they could merge even with just two of them. Megatronis thought, what strange forms the combiners were, to surrender their individuality and merge together like that. It repelled him, he hated them, all of them. It stopped, perhaps 40 mechanos above the center of the pit floor, and then extruded tentacular cables unspooled to catch on girders and keep the combiner up in the air. From there, it rained energy blasts down on him from legs modified for blasters, occasionally swooping lower to release globules of acid from its mouth. The combiner fled as Megatronis's battery of proton blasters exploded across its carapace and severed one of its cables. It fell, swinging back down on the other cable toward the arena floor, and Megatronis roared toward the higher end of the arena, closing with a speed it hadn't anticipated. It zigzagged through the pit, jinking so close to the balconies that the front row audience alternately ducked away or reached out to grab it. Megatronis caught it up near the top of a debris pile that was the highest point on the arena floor, resuming his protoform as he collided with it and kept hold, one hand on an arm and the other clamped on its thorax. His optics briefly flared out as it jammed an energy cannon in his face and fired, and the savage glee of the crowd vibrated in all of Megatronis's sensors. It was time to put an end to this. Megatronis sprang up over the confused combiner and produced twin maces in both hands. He then stomped down on the combiner's back, keeping it in place. The combiner chattered, attempted to split, and failed, its limbs scurrying for leverage and purchase, but he was far too strong. Megatronis raised both maces and looked around the crowd, which was, he thought scornfully, even more crazed than before. Next, they would send out min icons for him to step on. Megatronis is defeated by whom? He roared out, and struck, lubricants and bits of combiner spattered him, no one. Megatronis never loses. He struck again and again, butchering the combiner where it lay, then he emptied his hands and raised his arms again. I still function. Would you challenge me? He said, pointing into the throng as he strode from one end of the pit to the other. You? Anyone? Now challenge me for everything I've ever won, any 5 or 10 of you. Megatronis never loses. Back in the center of the pit, he kicked apart the remains of the combined insect icon flyer and flung pieces of it into the crowd for trophies. Remember that you saw Megatronis, he yelled. You've never had a better day. Do not forget. Like Energon or life itself, their praise descended upon him. Megatronis reflected, I will never again be nameless. We are Megatronis. We are Megatronis. As the chant became more intense, something strange occurred. The crowd decided to end the chant on a strong syllable, so the last syllable of the moniker began to fade out. Megatronis listened and felt a strange thrill as his name modulated, changed, transformed, and was given a name that no Cybertronian had ever carried. The arena shook with the force of the chant. The words Megatron and Megatron. I'll be Megatron, he thought. Additionally, Cybertron won't be the same. No Cybertronian could stand in his way as he lifted his arms amidst the pit's smoke and debris as well as the broken bodies of his opponents. Megatron was destined for greatness, he would soon lead the gladiators and cease to be a gladiator. The majority of the underground space in the factory complex was now devoted to the illegal but extremely lucrative gladiator tournaments, where gladiator mechas and Cybertronians lived, trained, fought, and were repaired. The ones who died were turned into useful scrap. He triumphantly strolled out of the pit and into the complex of abandoned maintenance tunnels beneath a factory that had once produced parts for semi-autonomous mining machinery. All of this had been controlled by a syndicate of criminal bosses who operated the gladiators like machines until maybe an orbital cycle ago. The caste that produced workers in Kaon's factories was ignored by the higher castes, and the government and engineering castes never gave their fellow Cybertronians who worked as slaves in the refineries and smelters a second thought. The criminal syndicate exploited this in a number of ways, including creating the gladiator circuit and manipulating the circuit's results. The situation reached a breaking point when Megatron was approached by the bosses one day with an offer. "You're the best gladiator we've ever seen," they said, "a true immortal, but the stands weren't as full and wouldn't be as long as everyone knew you would win." Megatron had anticipated what would happen at that moment, following a bout that was similar to the one he had just competed in a room that was similar to the one he was standing in now. The employer stated, "We need someone else to win, but just once or twice. Start the next time you go into the pit." According to Megatron, it had been one of those rare moments in a sentient being's life when they had to choose between giving over control to someone else and fighting to the death to maintain it. After he made the decision to fight, the bosses and their powerful bodyguards were all gone save for one, so Megatron sent him out to announce that the gladiator pits were being run by new people. Now that Megatronis was gone, Megatron reflected on that moment, that turning point, when he entered the infirmary and saw Soundwave and Shockwave waiting for him. "Soon you'll be leading more than gladiators," Shockwave said, approaching to assess Megatron's damage. Shockwave was Megatron's pet mad scientist, the type of mind that would take two seriously injured gladiators and attempt to turn them into one super Cybertronian. He lacked the ethical sense Megatron had ever been able to recognize, and Megatron did not trust him. However, Shockwave believed in Megatron, at least for the time being. Megatron knew that Shockwave would eventually turn against him, but in the meantime, the Cybertronian genius would be Megatron's most devoted ally until then. Soundwave was a different story. He was a spymaster extraordinaire and the controller of a horde of min icons so small that Megatron could crush several of them with a footstep. Soundwave was the only gladiator Megatron had ever faced that had a chance of defeating him because they had met in a match to first wound rather than death. Otherwise, only one of them would still be alive. He was almost as dedicated and single-minded as Megatron, and he had a suite of skills that Megatron almost envied, including his multiple transformations and the 3 min icons he contained in his protoform and could eject into battle at any time. These were Rumble, Ravage, and Laserbeak. Megatron looked around and saw no min icons, which was good for him because he didn't trust any of them. He wasn't good at deceit, he didn't like lying unless it was absolutely necessary, and he would have much rather taken anything he wanted from Cybertron by using simple force. He kept Soundwave and Shockwave close by in part because he trusted them to remind him that, although Megatron was powerful, he could still gain from allies whose skills matched his. "Minimal scarring from the acids," said Shockwave. "The energy weapons had little effect, as is typical. Megatronis, you emerge from a battle with few signs of ever having been in a battle. What fascinating prototypes I could create from you, Megatron." Shockwave halted in the middle of his daydream, blinking and bringing his envisioned army of supermechs modeled after Megatron back to reality. "What?" You heard the crowd. "I am Megatron." Shockwave and Soundwave exchanged glances and exclaimed, "All hail Megatron." They uttered, Orion's perspective. The twin points of moon bases 1 and 2 were visible between me and the stars when I looked up at them. Triptychon Station, the other near Cybertron object, was hidden on the opposite side of the planet. I thought about some of what I had heard Megatron say as I strolled through Iacon's swooping streets and bridges. Every Cybertronian has the right to freedom. Perhaps, but what did freedom mean? If there were no castes, if Cybertronians were not organized and directed into productive lines, if every Cybertronian just did what he wanted to do, the entire planet would fall into chaos. I recall learning that freedom meant having the freedom to participate in the tasks that were appropriate and necessary for the caste you were born into. but I was unable to identify it until I saw a group of organics having fun in a lush green land with a light blue sky and white fluffy objects. I'm not sure why, but something disturbed me, but as soon as I began to think about it, it was gone. Sentinel Prime had never publicly stated it, but he had supervised the development of the caste system, protecting Cybertron when individualism threatened to shatter the Cybertronian civilization into opposing splinters. This was the teaching of who, exactly? The higher castes are the ones who profit from the caste system. Why do they exist? I ascended a tower to an observation deck that offered a panoramic view of Iacon. The outline of Cybertron, the living manifestation of Primus, curved in all directions, with canyons leading to the interior where plasma welled up from the well at the center of Cybertron, dividing the surface. To the west, I could see the highest peaks of the Manganese Mountains, and to the north, over the horizon, was 6 lasers over Cybertron. When I thought about the amusement park, I felt a twinge of rage because I had never been there. It was reserved for the upper castes, and I had not yet been one of those fortunate lower caste members. People know what's best for them. Who but you can decide what's best for you? I know what I need. I'd like to visit 6 lasers, I thought. However, the park would be overrun if someone approached 6 lasers and insisted on entering whenever they felt like it. Structure was required, and people would never force structure on themselves, would they? Not at all. Sensible beings came together and made decisions for the benefit of all, but not all of them would be advantageous to each individual. I was confused, unsure of what I should be feeling or thinking. What I need is a conversation that doesn't take place in my own thoughts. I asked my little turbo fox Kurama what I should do, knelt down to touch him without expecting a response, and said, "Let's go see Jazz," picking him up and walking to Jazz's house. After Orion Pax found him and met him in McAdam's old oil house, Jazz remarked, "What should we do is go to Kaon and see the gladiator fights for ourselves." Are you serious? They're against the law. I don't believe it's even lawful to view one. He drained his can of Visco and gestured to the bartender for another. We could go, Jazz said, and if some authority discovers us, if we get arrested or questioned, I'll claim it's a cultural investigation. That is what I do, That doesn't seem to stop any of the people who do it, he said. It was true that Orion Pax had met Jazz because he was a cultural investigator who was tasked with sorting out all of the communications and other information that Orion Pax collected from the grid every day. Jazz frequently visited the Hall of Records in search of this or that piece of history, and they became friends. Orion Pax was a little intimidated by Jazz's carefree attitude toward life and authority because his caste was higher than his own, which allowed him to get away with more. But it was also true that Jazz was more interested in breaking the law than Orion Pax had ever been. Kaon is all the way on the other side of the planet. I've never been anywhere near there, he said, sipping his own Visco. As he spoke, he realized that he had intended for the words to sound contemptuous, but instead they sounded nostalgic. Orion Pax had never seen much of Cybertron, but he had heard its people talking from every corner, tower, and station on the planet. He had categorized their transmissions and conversations so that individuals like Jazz could visit the Hall of Records and use Orion Pax's work as a starting point for theories. He suddenly felt a connection to the factory workers. They created machines, and he created data. Were they really that different? Yes, Orion, you're different. Your work won't kill you. And when you can't do it anymore, nobody's going to throw you into a heap and turn your broken body into data cubes or image matrices, the cultural investigator said with a giggle when he brought this up to Jazz. Jazz's remark, "You're not pulling any punches," struck Orion Pax like a physical blow. After saying, "Those who are fortunate should know how fortunate they are," Jazz took a sip of his Visco and bided his time until Orion Pax had a chance to gather his thoughts. "I wonder if I could get in contact with him," Orion Pax murmured following a pause. The Visco, as usual, energized him and gave him hope. With whom? This Megatron? Perhaps, Jazz shrugged. Why would you want to? You don't think he's fascinating? Returning to the village of Hidden Leaf, it's been a couple of weeks since Kushina started working on tracking seal to bring back her son Naruto. Kushina managed to scratch the surface of the track seal and feel, but she's nowhere near done, and her two daughters seem to notice that their mother's avoiding them more and their behavior and attitudes started to change. One of them, Naruto, blames her brother for running off, leaving their mother heartbroken, and their father as well now. Their mother doesn't even want to leave the library for who knows what she's doing, and there all she could do was blame her brother, that idiot, stupid, worthless of a brother. So of her problems. As for Narumi, training day in and day out to get strong enough to find her big brother that she loved with all her heart. She blames herself for her big brother running away. All he wanted was their parents' attention, but he never got any of that. She and her sister did leave him all alone in the background. She knew deep down her sister didn't care for her brother, and she stopped training. Narumi noticed something in the sky. Looking up at the starry sky, seen a shooting star fly by. She wishes on that star that one day she'll find her big brother, but for now she has to get strong enough to find him and help him to bring them back home. Returning to Cybertron, this is what I was intended to do, Jazz chuckled. I find everything interesting. Listen, Pax. If you want to go to Kaon, let's go. I can secure research travel tickets, and I can say that I need someone like you to gather data. Should I speak with the archivist? History moves in cycles, Orion Pax remarked after looking at this for a while as he absently stroked Kurama's head. This much I've seen just rooting around in the archives, he added. I thought you weren't supposed to be rooting around in the archives, Jazz said. Careful you don't step outside the boundaries of your caste, my friend. How am I unable to? I have a mind, I can think and analyze, Orion Pax said, finishing his Visco. Jazz said, if you say so, after waiting the correct length of time. Easy for you to joke, you can do whatever you want. I'm a data clerk, Orion Pax said, leaning across the table toward his friend. He had complete faith in Jazz and felt free to say things to him that he would never say to anyone else. Where is it written that I have to stay a data clerk? Do the primes have a ledger out in one of the spiral arms somewhere? Does it have my name next to the title of data clerk? Jazz remarked, you sound a bit like your gladiator friend, but I don't think so. After giving it some thought, Orion Pax said, he's not my friend, but maybe it's time I spoke with him. He spent his days navigating the grid's matrices and intersections, so if there was one thing Orion Pax had learned from this, it was how to send a message across the grid that only the intended recipient would be aware of. On his subsequent shift, in the dim silence of the Hall of Records data mining section, Orion Pax went about his work, but he was also devising a plan to send a covert message to this gladiatorial insurgent Megatron. He struggled to decide what to say because there were so many options. He considered it throughout his shift before deciding on something straightforward because he had to leave. Though you may not realize it, more people are listening to what you have to say. Let's talk. Using a dead-end piece of storage space that wasn't coded for anything in the current grid setup, he added contact information to it. After that, he sent it off and stayed up late looking for additional clues about Megatron's thoughts, actions, words, or plans. He answered, Orion Pax remarked when he saw Jazz at McAdams the following day. I assume that he is this Megatron. What did you say to him? Jazz inquired, that he had more of an audience than he might have expected. What did he say, too? He said, you are more right than you know. I am also more right than you know, Orion Pax remarked, shaking his head in astonishment. Confidence, he replied, is there not enough of it in this one, is there? Jazz laughed loudly. Orion Pax remarked, then he agreed that we could meet. Jazz's expression changed to one of seriousness. Are you willing to risk anything? I used to be casual about it, But you should think about it because the repercussions could be far worse for you than for me. Orion Pax declared, "I'm ready." Alpha Trion tapped the quill's tip against his desktop. The text of a conversation between his clerk Orion Pax and the gladiator-turned-revolutionary was displayed on a screen in front of him. The word revolutionary was loaded, but it seemed appropriate if Megatron's version of events could be believed at all.